All right. So we're going to be talking about, Nick, did you want to say something to start?
I said, before you joined, I said, I just want an apology for Brett because this is playing out exactly how I thought.
Oh, no. What do you, I think you're misunderstanding the implications of what's going on here. As in the fact that China, and what we're talking about here is DeepSeek and DeepSeek R1, which is a China project, ostensibly run by like a hedge fund on the side, but practically probably heavily subsidized by the Chinese government, where they released a extraordinarily performant logic model, AI logic model, that is at least competitive with Chat or OpenAI's O1 model. And they open sourced it, so MIT licensed, so anybody can take the weights and run it and modify it as they see fit. The kind of like interesting things that have happened here is, one, this is the first in the wild logic model that's competitive with OpenAI's, and it's an open source. It's not another closed commercial system that's been launched here. And the underlying model that they're using was trained extraordinarily efficiently, as in the final training run on kind of the pre-trained model that they've attached this logic module to was apparently less than $10 million. And so people are comparing, hey, on the one hand, you have OpenAI and Anthropic and xAI spending billions of dollars training a model, and this Chinese shop as like a, nights and weekend project, trained just as performant a thing on a $6 million training run. Oh my gosh, why are we spending all this money? What a waste of resources from these large cap tech companies to invest in all these data centers to train these AI models when China can basically, with money they found in the couch cushions, train as performant a model kind of on the side.
No, right. So that's welcome everyone. That's the hot lead into episode 76 of the Brainstorm. Greg, can I quickly just summarize what you just said and you tell me if it's right? Because as I've been going through X, it seems like really there's two key arguments going on in the weeds, and then there's like a more orthogonal thing. And it's like, to what you just said, there's the one that touches on how is AI developing, right? So you have pre-training was a vector, and now inference time compute, right? Like there's a third one that we've discussed, and I think that's from like a Google paper on like at test time memorization or something. But it's like right now people aren't even talking about that yet. So we've got right now the arguments like pre-training versus, at inference time throwing more what test time compute, right? So that's like one axis of debate currently, and the threat vector. And then the other one that I've seen is like Jevons paradox versus efficiency. And so saying on one end, as you make something cheaper, you use way more of it than you ever thought imaginable. And that's people saying, this doesn't actually hurt NVIDIA or any of these companies because we're going to use way more of it. And the other side of it being the efficiency side saying, look, we don't need as many GPUs as you thought. That's coming down. We don't need as much power as you thought. Is that an accurate summation of what?
Sure. And let's start with the latter, because I think it's actually a little bit simpler to put our hands around. And I'm actually curious if you all disagree with my take here, because the idea that, hey, here is a model that was efficiently trained, that has now been propagated to everybody, means that we don't need GPUs for AI training to nearly the same degree anymore. And so then therefore, like Microsoft is going to pull back on its CapEx, and that's going to hurt NVIDIA's sales. And Google is going to, it's going to be a waste of money that they're investing in all these TPUs. And Meta is basically going to just like be like, all right, we have enough GPUs. We don't need any more. To me, seems completely backwards and wrong, because the the fact that you can do this very efficiently does not mean throwing more resources at it won't result in even more high levels of performance. In fact, what they've done is they've published the recipe for doing it efficiently. And so in some ways, they've restarted the race, as in now, what's to stop Oracle from turning around and saying, hey, yeah, we're going to take their recipe and we're going to try to like spin up something that's competitive with Grok and Gemini and Anthropic and OpenAI. And Meta is not going to be like, well, okay, that llama thing was a good idea, but it looks like we've been surpassed. No, they're going to take all of that CapEx and they're going to throw it into, hey, what happens when we turn the volume up to 11 on this thing in terms of how performant it's going to be? And it definitely means that the cost of machine intelligence for an end user has fallen a lot. And so the idea that you can have essentially an order of magnitude cost in access to machine intelligence, and you're not going to end up with an explosion of people building applications on top of that, and so then have lots of compute demand on the inference side, seems to me insane. And so if anything, I fall strongly into the camp that kind of this is accelerating cost declines. This is a space that's been cost declining faster than any other space that we've seen. So far, every like massive cost decline has resulted in a giant market expansion, not a market contraction. And this is going to be the same, where it's going to like it inspires a new kind of competitive set of jostling between the competitors who have capital. So they're going to spend the capital to try to stay at the leading edge pack. And then two, it actually opens up a whole nother layer above of application developers and software developers who can develop on top to find those killer apps that then is going to have businesses and users use the heck out of this stuff, which then also requires a lot of kind of chips to run it all.
So I think we all agree, Nick, tell me if I'm speaking incorrectly for you. So I think we all agree. It's like on that compute side, no question about it, right? I think this leads to far more investment on that side. But the second piece of what you just said, I think is where the interesting conversation becomes, which is, okay, this competitive jostling. And so it's like, this certainly seems good for incumbents, but not great for the open AIs, the closed AIs of the world.
Well, I think, Sam, to your point, I agree with you, Brett. I think the market's interpretation that this hurts the hardware space is misguided. I don't think it was a coincidence that Zuckerberg released their new internal CapEx forecast for 60 to 65 billion in compute spend and released numbers around, building out a data center the size of Manhattan the week that all of this was, or last week when all of this started bubbling up. And I think it is, if you look, I found this on Threads, not X. Jan LeCun tweeted or threaded. It's so hard these days. But
even tweeted is wrong.
He talked. Yeah, I didn't get any of those right. But he was talking about that the majority of the spend, and he has insights into what Meta is doing, is actually on the inference side. So the majority of this CapEx spend is happening on the inference side. And to your point, Brett, if the cost declines keep coming down for use and all of this becomes more efficient and it becomes better for the end consumer, you're going to need to scale compute regardless because of inference, because all of this is going to be needed, to happen at the edge. One thing I've been seeing is, could all of this happen locally on device, which is an interesting question maybe we can get into. But I agree with you, Sam, and maybe Brett, this is where we might differ, is if the model providers become commoditized, as in every 2 week, there's a 2 week lag between the next performant model. And when you have a breakthrough like this, you just wait another 2 weeks and someone else, comes out. How exactly do you build a sustainable business around that versus what becomes more interesting is the distribution of these models. And to your point, the app layer that takes place on top of it. I would think that the incumbents are in a much more advantageous position because they have scaling a direct to consumer business is just as capital intensive, if not more, because of marketing and trying to reach, parity and scale with what incumbents have today. That's where I begin to question how sustainable is this? Because everything we've seen also points to these apps and businesses being built on top. Without distribution, another company can be spun up in a week and be just as performant as your business if they're using the same model provider. So the business and the use case itself also gets commoditized. So the switching cost between users, because the interface is basically just a chat bar for most of this, also becomes, not it becomes something that the consumer doesn't have to think about as much. And so you just go to whatever is cheapest and easiest to use that probably already fits into how you navigate the digital world. So that, in my opinion, puts the digital, players, the monopolies of today, in a very advantageous position.
I just caution you on one thing, which is if you look at tokens delivered to end consumers, OpenAI is probably the incumbent from that perspective.
I think OpenAI is in a league of its own because they've built out their own distribution. Like they've crossed the chasm of, a couple 100 million users. So they're in a different bucket than maybe the rest of, the wrapper space and some of these other providers out there. I think they've probably largely escaped what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I think, and also like they're for some of the incumbents, I mean, really for Apple and Google, I do think that this advance just makes it more likely that this is going to be the basis of a new operating system. Yeah. And so, you can see the way Apple Intelligence is being kind of like restrained by Apple because the users aren't really reacting to it in the way that they want, that they are going to have trouble kind of like shifting an existing operating system base over to the way this new thing works. And so I think that like all of the underlying disruptive thesis is actually accelerated by this, not reduced by this. And I think you're right that returns to distribution, if this layer commoditizes, if this reasoning thing becomes open source and available, then returns to distribution are higher than they would otherwise be. And so kind of like that user facing side, you can like generate more returns, but you have to then be building kind of like some kind of user facing application on top of this, or set of user facing applications that people find useful. Right. But if anything, it's like, this is a competitive game board that is totally scrambled right now, like more so than it was even 2 weeks ago. And 2 weeks ago, it felt really kind of dynamic. And the other thing to think about here, and actually maybe we can transition a little into kind of under the hood what happened with DeepSeek, because I think it's important to understand kind of competitive dynamics here. Like, so the DeepSeek, yes, spent very little on a training run. They had gobs of money coming from probably Chinese government to do all of the experimentation and iteration to figure out the architectural breakthroughs that they used. So that's another reason why this argument that, hey, like having a big data center is no longer useful is wrong. You need the big data center to do the experimentation to find kind of like these architectural innovations that then distinguish you. And the other thing they probably had, one thing we know they had is along the way, they took shortcuts by training on the outputs from OpenAI's models, so called model distillation. So you can imagine if you're pre-training a model, you're grabbing random Reddit threads off the open web. Well, you're training the model on a bunch of idiots and some smart people. And so kind of like the idiots bleed down and dumb down your model. So if instead you also kind of like have a set of questions that you ask an already very performant model, and you say, hey, I need to like get a good view of history here. So I'm going to extract basically all the historical knowledge out of GPT-4o by mechanistically asking it all these questions, collecting a data set, and then feeding that in to my new model, with a heavy weight, because I know these are more likely true than the random Reddit threads. Then I end up with a much more performant model, much less expensively, taking advantage of the fact that OpenAI has spent all of this money to crunch down and distill the idiots from the smart people on Reddit, and so it's not that they started from scratch. It's that the DeepSeek team did some smart architectural things and then, built themselves on top of the frontier model advances that had happened thus far. And what we don't know, but I think it's fair to suppose, is that they also had access to whatever data the Chinese government has scraped from everybody.
Question on what you just said.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like one, there's like some element of like the reward function that they did as well. Right. But it's on better data because they scraped out the idiocy. Do you think the same holds true for autonomous driving in that it's like right now you need to collect an insane amount of data as evidenced by Tesla to get to a model that functions for an autonomous vehicle. But then once you have an autonomous vehicle, if someone then straps a GoPro, say, to an autonomous vehicle, then it's like they have much higher quality data because they know this is a functioning autonomous car than the huge issue of having to scrape through and sort and find out edge cases of terrible human drivers.
But I think one of the responses to this might be, in a way, OpenAI is a little better positioned than, say, Anthropic here. Is the reason DeepSeek was able to do this against OpenAI's models is because they had an API interface against the frontier model, and so they could autonomously query this thing over and over and over again, and actually put it into the situations they needed. Ask it the hard math question that they needed the answer to, at least at the edge of that model's capability. And so it could be that OpenAI actually occludes its next gen models from API access. Instead, it's only through ChatGPT. You basically have to pay for an operator. You have to pay for an autonomous agent. You can't kind of like at scale get this thing without paying us a lot more than we're currently charging to protect themselves from that data exfiltration. Now, whereas with a Tesla autonomous vehicle, you'd have to buy all the cars and have them drive around. So there's not like the same mechanism by which you could at scale extract data unless you could get access to the underlying weights of the system and run it in simulation in some way. And so that would be more like corporate espionage type stuff, which Tesla should be wary of, that would then allow them to kind of like take what was learned and skill up another competing model to that degree. But if somebody were to actually steal the weights of Tesla, why would they bother building their own? Just like put it in their car and say it's theirs and let Tesla come after them. So,
Brett, I'm curious your take, just thinking about where the value accrues. And I was reading a piece this morning about the VC space and just the amount of money that's gone on the private side into some of these model providers. How do you think about the longevity of those businesses and the moat of those businesses if what you're saying, continues to happen, where you have a model just being trained on a $100 billion model, but you do it for $5 million, then you can just, in theory, just continue to do that. And so how do you, as an investor, look at a model provider and say, okay, here's another $10 billion for you to get all of your work copied in 2 weeks, and for us to no longer have a moat?
Yeah. I mean, I think actually it's useful here because we've basically been talking about how they pre-trained the model underlying this R1 advance. So now let's talk about reinforcement learning and something that I think is a thesis that I've had that's probably offsides now, which is, Gemini and OpenAI have all of this great user data coming in, right? And there's an idea, I think it still could hold water, but call it like that all of that user interaction with the model provides them with data that allows them to further accelerate their model in terms of performance against others.
But it turns out the users are dumb, and it's better to just have the model question itself.
Well, right. So what DeepSeek did, and what OpenAI presumably also did with O1 and has done with O3, that we don't know because they didn't publish, is instead of is basically to have the model compete with itself on in subject areas with verifiable objective truth, like math and coding. And so you can imagine there's these very advanced math and coding benchmarks that are publicly available. You have the model ask or try to answer a question, and it throws out 8 different answers, and then you rank them in terms of their completeness. And then the entire answer that looks better kind of gets fed back in and changes the model weights. So this is different from pre-training, where you are judging the next word if it's a good word relative in the context of the sentence. Here you're judging entire answers at a time, and this is how reinforcement learning it seems really provocative and interesting. I think people that have tried to do it in the past, you can end up with like 0 performance output. The model gets stuck in some doom loop of like, I don't know, just like not going down productive pathways. And so though people had the idea that they could do this in the past, the underlying models just weren't good enough, particularly at verifiable things like math and coding, to get it into this like to prime the pump so that you could like build up this big capability. And the benchmarks weren't necessarily hard enough. So it didn't get into this, I'm going to logically figure this out. It was kind of like, hey, I can guess, and that's pretty good. As in like, if you're testing it on 10 times 10, it comes to its mind. It's 10. It doesn't have to be like, let's see, I'm going to add 10 to itself 10 times, and so kind of that strategy for improving the reasoning of a model is now been demonstrated in an open source way to be a way to deliver a lot of logic performance. Okay, so what does this have to do with kind of OpenAI and Anthropic's positioning and kind of like competitive differentiation at that space? Well, everybody's going to do this now, so you're going to have a lot of models at this level, and then it's a question of like how motivated and kind of agile a kind of R&D force do you have that can then build off this to build kind of interesting additional capabilities. And it could be that this layer is like, as in my Mac OS is running like Linux under the hood, right? Like, it could be that this layer really is commoditized. And then it's like, well, I need to figure out kind of what applications like do I build on top of this that are very useful. Like for OpenAI, like the voice interface is profoundly useful for me. I spent the last, half hour I was driving arguing with it about reinforcement learning. And it was really like, I learned a lot, and so kind of like figuring out exactly how do you like attach stuff onto this to continue to differentiate is going to be the competitive game. But it's a more open playing field than it was 2 weeks ago.
All right. So then just to circle back to the original framing and throw in quick summary answers here. So the first one was, pre-training versus test time compute. The conclusion there is, one, this is a tool that's added to a toolbox. It doesn't short circuit anyone, right? So there's still those two, both vectors can be improved upon. And now you've got a new tool that actually aids in both directions. And we didn't discuss it, but there's more vectors that are going to emerge on how you actually improve these things. And then on the other, we had the Jevons paradox. This is going to create tons of demand because it's getting cheaper versus, this is way more efficient. So it's going to, all the fears about billions of dollars and tons of power demand are overblown because this is a tenth or more efficient, or I guess it would be 10 times more efficient. So you don't need that. And we're all leaning towards this is super impactful and will drive demand on hardware.
But I'll just add that because of inference time compute, like it actually does mean, if you imagine the current playbook for Google, Meta, Anthropic, OpenAI, Mistral, which is now no longer really trying to play, and XAI is we're going to dump a ton of resources into kind of like the training compute side, because then that gives us some advantage kind of for the thing we deliver. Now, if the tons of resources instead has to be dumped onto the inference side, that does mean that these other players can come in and be like, hey, I'm not going to spend all this CapEx to train this thing. I'm just going to like provide users with, hey, here's an interface where you can ask a hard question and my thing can think for 5 minutes and delivers a better coding solution. Like it does mean the capital requirements to kind of enter the game have changed, where you can,
right. The fiber's already been laid.
Yeah. And so the argument, Nick, for kind of like real commoditization causing harm here is, think back to the internet. Like AOL as an ISP launched and then layered in kind of like a bunch of content with their dial-up business, right? And and their whole thing was like, we're mailing out disks so people will dial up to the internet through us. And then, hey, broadband happened. Now, broadband was unequivocally good for internet user demand. Like, all kinds of businesses depend upon that speed. You did not have a reduction in the use of the internet because of broadband. You had like an explosion in the use of the internet because of broadband. But basically that transition is not a transition that AOL weathered well. Right? As in, they were the gatekeeper to this slow access. And so then they were able to build competitive position on top of that. There was enough for them to get acquired by Time Warner. And, that probably like mangled their corporate strategy as well. But once broadband came about, broadband basically was distributed through all the different ISPs. That layer became commoditized. And then it was the application layer on top of it that where all of the value was built. Well, here, if kind of like the logic engine previously we thought was the kind of like, this is the gating factor to doing this stuff, and kind of like these AI frontier model providers are basically the AOL. If we're building services on top of this thing that's very dear and expensive, and we're kind of giving it away to subsidize to build out this business, and suddenly the equivalent of broadband happens, which I think you can interpret DeepSeek R1 as broadband intelligence, right? This is going to be kind of like, you're going to have very high throughput intelligence available in all kinds of applications. Well, maybe that does blow up this competitive position that was around, hey, this is like a really expensive thing that people are agonized against, and just creates, you end up with an explosion of applications on top of it. And who knows what happens to those CapEx dollars? Really, maybe it really is depreciated. And so we'll see.
Okay. And then we've discussed what I'd call the weeds element here in the weeds. But now the perhaps bigger question is, China is here, right? I feel like that's, everyone's caught up in the minutia of it, but it seems like, one of the bigger things was, China is nowhere to be seen on these benchmarks, I would say, relative to all of this. And obviously you can say whatever you want about funding all of this, but it's like, this is China. They did it, and it seemingly caught everyone off guard. What do you make of that, Brett?
I think usually, there's also lots of areas where if China decides to throw state resources at a sector, that pollutes the economics for everybody competing at that level. But actually, it's really fascinating to me, and I would say surprising, that they open source the model weights and publish the recipe, rather than just having it behind an API where it's like, hey, you can kind of, you can access this less expensively than you can the Western competitors. And then they would have attracted, Western companies would have been wary of it because what's happening to our data, but they would have attracted all of kind of like emerging markets and rest of world into using their model. So in some ways, like it is interesting to me that they chose to open source this. It basically means that it's harder to at least state of play today is suddenly reset. Everybody's at the same level again and can throw resources and create a model like this. And so where do we go going forward? I think, we go faster, and like in a more open, competitive, fierce, vicious terrain. I don't know.
Nick, where do you want to disagree with Brett?
I don't actually. Normally I feel like we disagree a ton, but I feel like we're very much in agreement on this. My brain just continues to go back to when it comes to the user, when it comes to the interface, because it's so intuitive, because it's a general purpose technology, and you're typing in and receiving almost exactly what you want when you ask a question, or you prompt this intelligence engine. To me, that is a very hard product to build a moat around if you don't have existing distribution. As in, if all three of us had the same, and most of these are the exact same interface, it's just a search bar with a prompt, and then you receive text or image or video as an answer. Audio as an answer. What would distinguish a listener in this podcast to pick my service over Sam or Brett's? It's really hard for me to think about exactly how you go about building. And this is where I think maybe we differ, Brett, because I think the application layer, I've seen a lot out there that speaks to you're going to have specialized models for specialized tasks. And that might be true, but I think the broader market, the larger opportunity is a general purpose digital assistant that does the majority of what a user is looking for when they go and use the internet. And I think that is a massive multi-trillion-dollar opportunity that really only the incumbents are set up to capitalize on because of how well this technology backfits into our current digital ecosystem. As in, even if you look at Operator with what ChatGPT or what OpenAI put out, Operator, it has to backfit into how someone uses and navigates the browser. It's like what we talk about in robotics. You're backfitting to a human figure. This is like backfitting into how a human goes out and uses the tools and services that these companies own. And that's why I always go back to this, because it's really hard for me to say, like, this is great for new entrants, but how? If this is going to be integrated at the operating system.
I mean, I
think because it's early. I think because it's early, right? It's like right now there's SEO, which drives a lot of things, and that's human driven. And right now it is, algo, right? It still applies to the operator and the AI models, right? Because it's like, who did they set it up for? They set up for the top Google results because that's what people use. But it's like in the future, it's going to be like API optimization for it's like whatever is easiest to interact.
But my point is building that back end, what you just described. There is no technical hurdle anymore for one company building that better than another. Everyone's going to have the same tools to use. And at the frontier, that means that these companies, their products and services, if you get rid of the veil on top, which is typically the user interface, the back end of it is exactly the same. If they're all using the same tools and services, then your only advantage is who has the most users, because that is ultimately what will drive further use because of network effects. So I agree with you.
I mean, I guess to our classic innovator's dilemma is it's kind of like if you have a existing business model that you're collecting cash flow off of, no matter how much resource you have, and actually even if you have a lot of resource and talent, it makes it harder. Then you have a hard time kind of like just adapting to a playing field that is totally transformed. And so the argument against the incumbents would be basically kind of their existing business. It's kind of like, why is Netflix rather than any of the content? Everybody owned all of the content and all the pipes to the consumers and had vertical integration through distribution and content production. And like, there's no reason why Netflix should be the biggest. It should have been killed 20 times between today and when they've gotten to today, and they haven't. And so the same, like to Sam's point, it's so early, and actually it undermines the fundamental economics of so many layers of kind of internet facing stuff that it's almost like level playing field. And so then the person with the marginal aggression and agile workforce, super hungry, willing to try things, might win against somebody who's like, well, we're making all this money over here and we don't want to do this too quickly. So that's, I think, the basic argument.
No, and I agree.
On that front, because you mentioned Apple Intelligence, we've debated Apple before. I want to touch on that right now, because it's like I said, it's like they don't actually need Apple Intelligence. Like they need it just because of marketing, whatever, but it doesn't really matter because it's so early. Gavin Baker posted out this morning, right? It's like maybe for the first time ever, you get a refresh cycle on smartphones that's not camera driven. right?
See, okay, but I actually disagree. There's a conceit that people have, and Nick, you might disagree with me on this, that there's this idea that kind of, hey, it's a prompt and it's all going to be user interacting with the thing where all of the action happens. What we've learned with inference time compute, and I think this is the vector by which kind of moat gets pulled out, is that actually what it's going to look like is I have a bunch of processes running behind the scenes run by AI on my behalf. It's not, and I'm going to spin them up, maybe even unintentionally, and they're going to be continuously running and protecting me from stuff and getting stuff for me. And so it's not going to be, I'm not going to be just stuck up against the phone interface. Instead, I'm going to have a set of relationships with a set of autonomous agents that is probably there's going to be heavy incentive to have it under one kind of silo that is just operating on my behalf. And with inference time memory, those agents will actually become increasingly customized to who I am and the set of preferences that I have. And so it's not going to just run through, this very expensive camera wrapped around a smartphone here. Right. It's gonna run through some abstracted interface, and maybe your tune into it will be through a set of eyeglasses. Maybe that'll be the right way to distribute and begin selling those agents to you. But I think the cost of switching will be the fact that you have 500 different processes running on your behalf with an AI model provider providing
and then
them
you're
all.
Have to rehire all your interns.
Yeah, you basically have to, there has to be somebody that sells you a business of transitioning you from one to another. And so it's actually, it'll be really disruptive think about how often people switch bank accounts. You never do that. Why? It's not because it's you can do it, but then all of your auto pay stuff gets messed up, and you know what I mean? And so it's not worth it to you to say, to get the incremental savings rate differential, unless you're really pissed off at your bank to do it. Or if you move town and change, cities or countries, and so I think that there is a future where that's kind of the way it works, and it's not tied through the device at all.
I think I agree with you, but I think the period in which you're describing, if the current incumbents can't innovate to what the newer entrants are doing in that period and keep users from offloading their data to new devices and new operating systems, given what we've seen where all of this technology is open source and available, then you have to have some, you must think very poorly of these companies and how they're run, because it's to say that Apple can't figure this out is a really, I don't know. It's it's missing the point.
Well, then maybe we end it with
it's all available to Apple has this now, right? So if they can't figure out how to put this in Apple Intelligence, then yes, they should not be, they shouldn't be worth what they're worth. But I don't want to bet against these companies' innovative history. It's a tough bet for me.
Nick, I think this the third discussion debate here that's emerging is you have distribution on one side, and you've got innovator's dilemma on the other side. And it's figuring out, innovator's dilemma doesn't kill everyone, right?
I guess
or Brett,
Sam,
innovator's dilemma doesn't kill everyone.
I'll put myself on a word count limit after. But I think my point here is that the innovator's dilemma is not as big of a deal. One, because the interface of all of this backfits very well into the current ecosystem and how we use the internet. And second, because all of this is open source and widely available, you don't actually have to commit a ton of capital and resources to be able to backfit this and make it a feature. How many of your current products?
Yeah. Okay. But wait, actually pause there for a second. Because imagine I have a business that's printing cash, billions of dollars a year, hundreds of billions, maybe. All right. And then imagine for zero cost, I can totally disrupt that business. Well, that means the marginal competitor will try to disrupt it because there's zero cost. But I will face $100 billion a year in losses to do it. So it's not costless. It's very costly. So I have to have a massively incentivized CEO who is just we are going to destroy our existing platform to jump to the next one. And I have to have the internal credibility to convince all of the lieutenants under that CEO that, yes, that's the right thing to do, even though kind of like their dividends might get hurt by it, and kind of like their cushy lifestyle. They'll have to go in on Fridays as opposed to like kicking back and drinking coffee on the Italian Riviera. They might actually have to like put in a few past 6 p.m. Yeah. No, I'm like dealing with the Palisades fire. I'm going from Airbnb to Airbnb, just trying to like make my life work. But the like, it requires being in a state of discomfort, I think, to win when the playing field has been leveled. And so like I remember AOL, I can't remember who went in charge of them, but one of his big things was like, we're actually working on Friday on summers now. Like we're going to turn this thing around. The entire workforce had decided they were only going to work 4 days a week during the entire summer. And that's just like, I don't think that's happening for all of these incumbent companies, but that is the state in which you can have an enterprise get. And I think it's really hard to change that, particularly if you're not someone who is going to go in and kind of like light the entire place on fire.
Yeah. So then my statement is not broad blanket. Everyone that has distribution today has distribution tomorrow. Obviously, there will be massive disruption, but I think there are certain, qualities or characteristics of some of these very, very, very large companies that prevent them from massive disruption. When you're saying that,
Nick,
we've already seen Meta mobilize, right? Like they've completely, they've laid off a ton of people. They're saying, performance, efficiency. So you're starting to see the response. And yes, you can say for the past, like basically decade plus, that Silicon Valley and some of these companies have gotten, fat, dumb, and happy. Right? But that doesn't mean they can't turn the switch overnight and figure this out. Like we saw Google in the last 2 years really begin to push boundaries that we didn't think possible when we were starting these conversations.
Sure. And it required a founder coming back and being like, yes, I'm going to stop, spending time on my yacht, and I'm going to go in and like motivate the workforce. I mean, I think
coming in on Fridays, that's all it takes. But, okay. So then maybe the way we end this, the Mag 7 driving the market, right? I think that's pretty clear. It's been the acronym for a year plus now. Which one do you think is most likely to be disrupted, and one that you think is most likely to benefit?
Right. You're defining Tesla into Mag 7 here as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
No. We'll keep that one out because that one, people know it's our largest holding.
Right.
We're very long Tesla.
Okay. So Mag 6. Mag 6. Okay. Nick, you first.
Yeah, I will go first. I think Meta has the most upside here in this world. I think one, if you look at it, they have the largest distribution footprint. They're reaching 3 billion, so half of the connected globe daily. So if they can't figure out a way to layer on their open source Llama models and productize this in a meaningful way, I would be very surprised. I think the company with the most at risk is Alphabet. Like I think you've probably won me over, Brett, a little more than I'd like to admit on, their ad business being, potentially under threat because of the innovation happening here. But I do believe that, a company with that distribution remains in a very advantageous position, because trying to get me to get rid of my Gmail and, Drive and all of that and not use Chrome is going to be a hard task. Yes, I've offloaded a lot of search to Perplexity and ChatGPT, but I'm still very much intertwined and committed to Google's core products in a way that I don't think I'm ready to give up yet, because it just, these are search competitors. They're not ecosystem competitors yet. They don't have everything Google offers me. It's the same for Apple. It's the same for some of these others. Like that's I'll end there.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting because I've like come around a little bit on Alphabet. I think because they have vertical integration through TPUs. They publish the test time memory stuff, so they're going to launch potentially that before others. So on the AI side, I actually feel a lot better about them than I did 18 months ago. And they do have this big, search business model, which is up for threat. But like the concern about that being under threat is that then it prevents them from actually shipping on the AI side. But now they're showing, some signs of life there. So, and then I just look at, like, if you imagine you level the playing field, the one that has the most value based on the current business
NVIDIA.
model, I think is most at risk. No, Apple is 3.7 or 3.8 trillion in market cap, at least as of year end 24. And of all the Mag 6, it's the most valuable, in part because it's trading at a higher multiple, than it has historically, as if the iPhone franchise is more durable, not less durable. And I think between their China exposure, between what does this mean if we change the operating system out, between like the marginal thing they've been shipping, one is a headset that failed because they lost the ability to curate product in an intelligent way. Why stick a stupid external screen on the outside of that thing? That seems like insane and dumb. Like they need Jony Ive to come back at least, since Steve Jobs is no longer alive, and be like, I'm going to fix Apple. But unfortunately, I don't think Tim Cook wouldn't invite him back. I don't think, or, maybe he would, but I don't think Jony Ive has kind of the competitive drive that Steve Jobs did. So I just think, if I look at the stack rank of all of them, then yes, I agree. Meta is only worth 1.5 trillion, a mere 1.5 trillion. And they have like a great open source model. They'll take what DeepSeek did and build on top of that to build even more. And they are their eyeglasses, or whatever they call them, their Ray-Bans and now Oakleys, right? Mm-hmm. Are going to just become more and more performant and serve as that distribution point that then gives you, like, they'll have the option to generate a big AI operator business based upon that distribution without tearing up an existing set of platforms to do so. So they have like much cleaner motivations about making this transition.
Yeah, I agree with you, but part of me believes that Apple is very much a sleeping giant, as in like they've yet to really fully commit to one path or the other. Like, yes, they have Apple Intelligence, but it's only been rolled out in beta and they've rolled back some of it. So they really haven't committed yet. They've set the framework, right? App Intents and building Siri as an operating system, I think is the right strategy. But until we see like real full commitment and they actually build a phone dedicated to AI. Like, I know they said that for the last one.
You should see the billboards outside my window. It's like iPhone, whatever we're on, Apple Intelligence. This is the reason you're supposed to buy the thing.
But until we see like real productization of it, I'm not ready to call it like under threat. I think they've afforded themselves enough time to play this slow. They have such a stranglehold on the consumer. They've actually given themselves
AirPods still under. It's like
right. That's
AirPods market share, and just the fact that everyone's willing to pay $1,000 for compute to them because they trust the ecosystem. I agree that's. It's like forget right. Even Brett, to your point, if the and obviously it takes a visionary and whatever to be able to change this. It's like, even if the interface changes, the fact that they have such good hardware, software verticalization, I think is underappreciated.
It's bad for Apple that my iPhone device right now is just a hotkey to OpenAI mainly, and a camera. As in, like, I guess the browser. Right. Like the underlying apps that I use on their device is shrinking, not expanding. And I think that the call it the narrative on Apple was, well, they wait till the technology is ready and then they release magic based upon that technology. Like that was like, when they released the touchscreen phone, people were like, touchscreens suck. And it's like, no, everybody else's touchscreens suck. Our touchscreens work. Now with both the headset and Apple Intelligence, that narrative has just failed twice in a row. As in, Meta's headset is just better. It's better for the price. The thing they released is it's like interesting, but it's more like other things that other companies do, where it's like, it's this overpriced, over-engineered like thing that doesn't really have a vision that's going to compel the consumers. And then with Apple Intelligence, it's also, yes, they waited until it was ready, and then they released something that like doesn't access any of the interesting stuff and actually doesn't really solve the problems for their consumers in a magical way. So I think I always like to invest in companies that traffic in magic. But once you've lost your ability to conjure, all of your products turn to clay. And I think this phone up here sitting on top of my laptop is actually turning to clay, and like the water of AI is going to melt it into a gooey mass of not goodness. And they have a huge balance sheet. They'll be fine. They'll pay out dividends. They have value investors that will invest in them. All kinds of stuff will happen from here, but I'm skeptical of them.
I'll end on this because I think what you're saying is true to an extent, but I go back to, and this is what I've been trying to get out, the fact that it's a hotkey to ChatGPT, given the nature of these products, your ability to swap in and out of that hotkey to whatever Apple releases in the next few months or years will be so easy, you will forget entirely about ChatGPT because of the nature. Like, these are like products that just aren't sticky to the consumer because it's just, simple search and
but not yet sticky.
Right. Like, they haven't begun to build that ecosystem around the core functionality of what we've been delivered. And that's where I get worried about these new entrants. Until you can deliver like a bundled service of different applications, only until then, like, that's when you have true stickiness with the consumer. Right now, you can swap in. Like, I use Perplexity, ChatGPT. I use them all, and it's like, for me, it's almost indifferent. Like,
that's what I was going to say. It's like, since when has Apple? I've never used Apple product on Apple device, right? It's like, what do I use on my iPhone? It's like, I use Facebook, then I used Instagram, I use Netflix, I use Spotify, I use OpenAI. It's like, that doesn't mean that I don't. Otherwise, you can use Android too. It's like, why isn't Android your hotkey to ChatGPT?
Yes, it's a good question. And because I've been like an Apple user for, since 2005, and, you have the constellation of devices. Like, there's a reason why they work. Like, there's a reason why, frankly, I prefer the watch to the iPhone. And you can see kind of the erosion at the edges of their kind of competence and quality. And you may be right. It's like the consumers are kind of stuck, even though like their marginal product sucks worse than even like a Pixel phone, I would imagine or I've heard is better than the iPhone, but it's only better within the context of starting from scratch. It's not better within the context if you have iPhotos and all their stuff that they've layered on top, so.
All right. I'm surprised neither of you, NVIDIA, you think, just to keep this, we're so close to an hour, we may as well just round it out here. NVIDIA, obviously the one that's run like crazy, huge demand in the future. But, if the fiber has been laid, it's like, is the growth going to be exponential, or does competition come into, right? Like, this has been a gold mine. How long does that last?
Well, but we've focused really on the kind of consumer technology, maybe enterprise worker side. But I actually think there are so many returns to real economy type stuff that will also inspire a lot of chip demand. Now, NVIDIA, I think it's a heavily competitive space. Like Amazon is going to induce Anthropic to use its Trainium chips. Meta, it's probably going to develop its own training chips. Tesla's probably going to develop its own training chips. Like, what will XAI do? We don't know. OpenAI is still on board, as is Microsoft. But, I'm uncomfortable with NVIDIA's margins. And we have larger than anybody in the world that publishes forecast expectations for AI compute demand by 2030. And DeepSeek R1 does not make me want to diminish that forecast. I think maybe even raise it even more. So those are the kind of like ways that I think about it. And it's really expensive for what it's doing today. So yes, maybe on a odds of multiple re-rating, I would put it higher than Apple, but then I think Apple has more cash flow at risk.
Well, and I think the one point here is on the inference side. Brett, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but NVIDIA doesn't have as big of a moat on inference compute they do on pre-training. So that may have some share shifts, but I think overall, the amount of CapEx spent on hardware is only going up because everything in our lives is getting more digitized. Like this is just AI is the biggest, but everything else is pointing towards more computation.
And like one way to think about it is there's 600 billion in semi sales this past year, and only roughly like a seventh of that went to AI specific compute. But like that's a huge, the other, bit is like a huge waste of transistors. Like all of our transistors should be going to AI right now. Right. But instead we're spending it on stupid transistors to run this stupid camera.
Smart ovens.
Yeah. So kind of like there's still, even within the overall semi stack, lots of room to like shift into like we're buying AI stuff, but it might not all come from NVIDIA. And like you say, Nick, like on the inference side, their competitive edge is definitely not nearly as much. And insofar as you're pushing into end devices, that's not going to go like with NVIDIA. So it's, call it open playing field. We are in an open state of war across all of technology simultaneously with the entire universe turning upside down with AI. Then that's like at a very high level. Why do I want to be sitting in a company that has, $4 trillion ish of enterprise value based upon the cash flow that this stuff is generating today when kind of the entire universe has been turned upside down? I don't know if that's the right spot to be.
The universe has been flipped all within a week.
Yeah,
that's right. So we're, you mentioned second half of the chessboard. Maybe we're back to square one of the chessboard. The chessboard's bigger than we thought.
The chessboard.
Well, but that's the whole point with compounding. It gets wild. So the chessboard analogy, and I know we have 1 minute until we go a full hour, so I'm going to use this 1 minute to its best advantage. Okay. The parable of the chessboard is kind of like the inventor of chess was going to be rewarded by his Indian ruler with a grain of wheat on each square doubled consecutively thereafter. If you do the math, that Indian ruler went bankrupt around the sixth row of the chessboard when it was like 20% of year 600 India GDP. But he went bankrupt. He had only paid out 0.001% of the ultimate bill because the compounding on the back half is just insane and crazy, right? And so this is the main thing that's happening here is we're still compounding. This R1 means like we're not slowing down, we're accelerating in terms of capability here. So I think the prospects for the future, I'm wildly optimistic, and I think there's less certainty than there's ever been.
There you have it. Maybe next week we'll just play a recording of Brett arguing with ChatGPT on audio. see how one of those conversations goes. All right.
I get a little antagonistic, but yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.